Thank you, Bubba and Matthew. And Happy New Year. As we get to this stage, I always think that, you know, we spent some time in December talking a little bit about the end of the year and reflecting on where we were, and also talked a little bit about individually where we were. I always think that in the new year is a great time to start thinking about going forward. And as I was trying to decide what to do this morning, I knew that grandson Liam, was going to be here today, and that my buddy, you all don't know Liam as well as you know some of the others because Ben's filled in here and brought the kids. But Liam has a couple of things that are really important to him. The single most important thing to Liam is Halloween. That is the big one. You know, Christmas is okay, but Halloween it's all about Halloween. And the second thing that Liam is very big on is animals, and he loves to go to the zoo, and I've taken him a couple of times to go to the zoo, and he loves reading about animals and studying about animals. And so I thought, you know, if Liam was going to be here, what lesson could I do that he might like and that would be a good one to start the new year with? And I decided to do a classic. If you have ever been a child, and I suspect most of you have been, and you were in church as a child, there's a pretty good chance that in one of your Bible classes as a kid that you studied about Daniel in the lion's den. And so early this morning, when Liam got up, he came and sat in Pop's lap, and we watched a movie about Daniel in the lion's den this morning because it is such a great, great story. Now, we're going to read what the Bible says about it. It's, you know, it's somewhat lengthy, so I'll go fast. But know, too, that a couple of words that are not necessarily familiar to us. The word satrap that we're going to read. A satrap, under Persian rule, was a ruler over a province. A governor at that time was one who was above the satraps, and a governor had responsibility for larger territory. And at the time of the story of Daniel, we encounter someone called Darius the Great. Now, Darius the Great is kind of an interesting character all by himself, because we know about Herod the Great, we know about some other greats, but we don't really know too much about Darius. But I will tell you, as the ruler of Persia, that Darius reigned for 36 years, okay? So that's who we're going to be looking at when we talk about the satraps and the governors and the emperor Darius. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one of those 3, that the satraps might give account to them, to the 3 governors, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find out some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever." Now all the governors of the kingdom and the administrators and the satraps, the counselors, the advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O King Darius, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which do not alter. Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Darius knew that the writing was signed, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled, and they found Daniel praying, and they making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which do not alter. So they answered and said to the king that Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, does not show regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you've signed, but makes petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, sat his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till going down of the sun to deliver him. And then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. And so the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. The king spake, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. And then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own ring and with the signets of the Lord's. And the purpose concerning Daniel was that it might not change. Now the king went to the palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him, and his sleep went from him. And the king arose early in the morning, and he went in haste to the den of the lions. When he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. May God, my God, send his angel. He shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. The king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take up Daniel out of the den. So that Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. The king gave the command that they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them and their children and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. And then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, and who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I want us to talk about what it means in 2025 to really live for God. Because the story of Daniel, I think, can be a real inspiration for any Christian who's willing to try to do it. And it doesn't make any difference whether we're talking about spiritual or physical or material blessings that God can provide for us in the new year, as he always has, and what he has promised that he will do going in the future. And so I want us to just look at a handful of lessons from the story about Daniel and the application of how we can be about living for God. First, living for God means attempting to live above reproach. Did you see what those scriptures said about Daniel? They couldn't find any charge, any fault. He was faithful. There was no error found about him. It is an effort on our parts to try to figure out how are we going to do that, because he was flesh and blood. He's just like us. He was human. And he faced all of the challenges that you and I faced. And yet, as we see in the story, he continued to find a way, even with all of the challenges of life, to be a faithful human. It's a quality that I think in Scripture we often find the word blameless used. That blameless is a qualification for elders, for bishops, And it's an important one for every Christian. So when Titus 1 says for a bishop, they have to be blameless, you know, it's saying that we are looking for someone to serve in that role who is above reproach. And that's what 1 Timothy 3 reminds us that a bishop is supposed to do. But Paul goes on in 2 Corinthians 6 and tells why that's important. He says that we don't want out of our conduct, our behavior, that there should be anything about our ministry that can be blamed. And that's why you and I ought to attempt to be blameless, because of the effect it can have on what we're trying to do for God. As we live as a light or as salt or a city set on a hill, we want to try to be blameless so that we don't become a distraction for what it is that we want people to see about God. Being blameless doesn't mean being perfect. However, it's interesting that when you look at it, the person repents if they are attempting to be blameless, just like Job did when we're told in Job 1 that he was blameless and upright and one who feared God and shunned evil. And yet when we look a little bit later in Job chapter 30, we see that what we famously refer to as the patience of Job, the patience of Job were completely run out. They were gone. He was tired of what was happening to him, and he starts making all kinds of claims and accusations toward God. And so Job knew that what he had to do was right after that, when God pointed out to him, Job, where were you when I did? And he named several chapters that we have recorded. All the things that God did that Job had no understanding about how God's power could have allowed him to do that. Job says, what have I done? I've got to change. I've got to repent, because he knew he'd crossed the line. And being blameless is what's expected of us. And it doesn't make any difference what your age is. You know, in 1 Timothy 4, when Paul told the young preacher Timothy, let no one despise your youth. Why would they despise it? Well, by seeing what young people often do. And he says instead, here's what I expect you to be and to do. And so the first lesson we get from Daniel is that we need to try to live a life where we work hard to be above reproach. The second lesson is that when we live for God, sometimes it will attract attention. And sometimes the attention can be negative, even enemies. You know, Daniel's challenge all started when King Darius liked Daniel. What does he want to do? There's 3 of us supposed to be in charge. Now he wants to not only put Daniel over the other 2, he wants to put us over all 120 of these satraps. We can't have that. The scripture says they begin to conspire about what can we do to keep this from happening. But is it all that unusual when people find out what you believe? What you stand for? That you can draw some criticism? And sometimes it can even be enemies. And it's fascinating to me that people who have historically been your friend are some that will sometimes see you as being self-righteous, or difficult, even boring. Why? Because of what you don't want to participate in. And that, sadly, even non-believing members of your own family can view you as irrational and weak and misunderstanding and even silly. That's not strange. It happens. Because of what Daniel believed, they went to all of that trouble to concoct a scheme where they could keep him from being in charge. And Daniel was favored among his peers in the eyes of Darius because of what he believed. And so when Paul says, don't be conformed, be transformed, so that you can prove what is in you. Our transformation is supposed to do that. And then in 2 Timothy, all who desire to live godly, notice the phrase, will suffer persecution. Now, we sometimes tend to think about persecution as what we still see in some third world countries, some communist-controlled countries, some countries that are controlled by the government that is going to do everything they can to keep Christianity from flourishing. But persecution comes in all shapes and sizes beyond that. And I would suggest to you that for the first time ever in my young life, I think I see persecution for what we believe. And I don't know that I would ever have said that before. But when James says, look, this relationship is confrontational. It's going to exist. It's going to happen in one of two ways. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? And whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You're either going to be a friend of the world and have a problem with God, or you're going to be a friend of God and have a problem with the world. Those are your two options. And it's going to go one of two ways. And so we need to think about the fact that when the Scriptures tells us things like John said, don't marvel if the world hates you for what you believe, that living for God and being friendly with the world are mutually exclusive. How worldly are you? How different are you? What are the things that separate you as a Christian, as a believer, from the rest of the world? And so when we think about 1 John 2, which is a passage that everybody probably could quote, don't love the world, neither the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father isn't in him. All the world, the lust of the flesh, the eye, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. All of that stuff that we're told that can happen as being a part of the world are the things that you and I have to be cognizant of and have to understand why we need to change. Living for God means attempting to live above reproach, but it also means understanding that doing some things may make you a target. Third, a lesson from Daniel. Living for God means not being afraid that there could be negative consequences of doing so. The video that Liam and I watched this morning was an interesting one, because when Daniel heard about the decree in the video, he wasn't excited about what was going to happen. He was fearful. He believed in God, he trusted God, but you know, he knew what that decree meant and what it could be. And so when he shows up at the lion's den, in the video, the look on Daniel's face was the same look that I think any of us would have seen if we were facing what he was facing. And so when Daniel faced this difficult decision, he had to decide whether or not he was going to remain faithful or not, or whether or not he was going to instead change his allegiance to the God of the Motherland, which was the 30 days of following the god Darius. For Daniel, the consequences seemed extreme, because they were. But he knew what he was going to have to do. And he could have said, look, it's only 30 days, God will understand. Or I can go 30 days without praying if that's what's necessary. Or he could have said, well, I don't have to pray publicly. You know, I can pray so that they don't have to see me. And there's no reason to lose all of this influence that I've had and that I've built up over my entire life over 30 days of prayer free. So he could have just said, I'm just going to step back for a few days to keep this from happening. Do we ever do that? Do we say, God knows my heart? Yeah, I had to miss church today. Got places we've got to do and go. And do we? Or we could say, you know, Sunday morning it was still, I chose to stay at home and rest on Sunday because you know how difficult it is at my work. Are we still the first one to get there on Monday? Oh, I wanted to be in worship, but God understands that I need rest. Now, Tom stayed up all night. He told us in Bible class. And then we started studying the absolute wrong book in Bible class because he stayed up all night. And he said, but he's here. And he's here. And you know what? I don't have a problem with studying Ephesians or Galatians or wherever he wants to study. If somebody can stay up all night and show up for church, they get my badge. And so Daniel's decision was that no matter what happens, regardless of whatever consequences come, as he looked into that den where the lions were, can you imagine what's going on in his mind? When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, then he goes home and opens the window and gets down on his knees, as was his custom, and opens toward Jerusalem and kneels down 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks. Catch the phrase. Waited till he knew that the decree was signed, and now I'm going to go pray. And if it means the lion's den, so be it. And we see that same sort of mindset that was in Paul and the other apostles. Remember when they were instructed, don't you be out in the market square here preaching this stuff. If you do, we're going to put you in prison. They said, okay. And as soon as they left, they headed for the market square to preach. You know, that's this kind of courage that says, hey, are you and I someday, are we going to face a decision where we have to be disobedient to the laws of our land in order to be faithful to our God? I never asked myself that question in my life. And I think we have to deal with it. And so when Romans 8 says, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy or be compared to what's coming, we have to keep remembering that and don't let that get away. We ought to obey God rather than men. The world, that you may have peace. In the world, you're going to have tribulation. Be of good cheer anyway. John 16, Jesus said, I've overcome the world. And Philippians 1, for if you've been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer, you have been granted an opportunity on behalf of Christ to suffer for His sake. That's exciting. We get to suffer. Not a very human thing to think about. We live for God in a way attempting to be above reproach. We know that we can face opposition, and we know that we have the potential for some negative consequences. But also, a lesson from Daniel is that living for God means creating time for His will. As we think about starting a new year and living for God, it's part of deciding how are we going to prioritize things. And so we have to think about the fact that Daniel had a custom. It was his custom and his respect for God that he was going to worship God. He had a place that he was going to have his prayer. He had a posture for his prayer. He had set periods of time for his prayer, and he knew how many times each day he was going to do it. And that was his custom. How many of us have customs? I would suggest to you, every one of us. Every one of us have customs. We have customs for our life. We have customs for our work. We have customs for our worship. And probably you, like me, have pretty much a set time for everything. What time do you get up in the morning? What was really very bizarre was working for however many years, nearly 40 years, getting up dark 30 every morning. And then I no longer have to do that. I get to sleep in. And getting up at dark 30 every morning when I didn't have to. Because that's our custom, that's our routine. You know, we have a time when we grab that first cup of coffee or we watch a particular TV show. We have time for our kids to be fed and to get their baths and all that sort of thing. We've got a time for everything. What's your time for prayer? What's your time for study? And is it your custom to go about engaging with God's Word or being engaged in your Christian service or in worship? And so often we chase butterflies instead of elephants. Years and years ago, I think I told you that in a time management class we were taught that all of us are ant stompers and not elephant hunters. That we spend all of our time, 80% of our time, stomping ants, grabbing low pieces of fruit, and the 20% of our time that's actually really important to us, we never quite seem to get around to. And so we have to decide how active we're going to be. At work, what do you attempt to do? Do you attempt to be a model citizen at work? Are you one of these that has to excel and be the best, that you're going to use whatever talent that you have been given? And if that's the case, do we do the same thing in our work as we attempt to live for God? because being a faithful Christian requires a form of dedication. And in Luke 14, you know, there's this passage that we sing songs about, kids' songs about, other songs. You know, that how many of you are going to go out and build something, you don't first think about it, try to figure out how to do it, and consider what it's going to take to get it done and do it right. Luke 14 says in our Christian life, we need to have both a plan and a commitment. We've got to finish. This isn't something that we get to half do. Terry Boatwright is so giddy today because he finished a lean-to on his shed this week. He knew he was going to do it. He was committed to getting it done. He's proud of the fact that he made it happen. You know, you and I, as we get older, as we approach the end of this life, we ought to be proud and excited and giddy that we have finished the work. And as Paul says, and has kept up the faith. And that there's laid up for us a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give Paul in that day. And he's going to give it to all those who are like Paul, who are believers, and do the same thing. We need to look at 2 Timothy 2 and Matthew 6 that talks about what are we supposed to do, how are we supposed to busy ourselves, what is our daily work supposed to look like. When the psalmist says, I've hidden your word in my heart that I wouldn't sin against you, it's a statement that says that we know what's important and that's what we're going to do. When Joshua said, don't let the book of the law depart from your mouth, shall it meditate in it day and night, and do according to what is written in it. And that way you will make your way prosperous and you will have good success. One of the things that we often hear about New Year's resolutions is that we're looking for ways to be prosperous and have good success. I want to tell you that I am not optimistic about 2025. My wife would not allow me to have cabbage and black-eyed peas on New Year's Day. And so when my finances go in the tank this year, I want you to know who's going to be blamed. You know, and that's what we're after, isn't it? Prosperous, that you're going to have good success. That's what we want. That we need to create time for God now before it's too late. You know, it was too late in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Let me go back and tell my brothers what I've learned. They have the law and the prophets. Let them listen to them, they are told. Living for God means attempting to live above reproach, knowing that we're going to face opposition, that there may be negative consequences, and that we have to structure our lives to create time for Him. And don't boast about tomorrow. God's going to take care of things. And that's what we're saying. Here's our last point. Here's what Daniel should be teaching us. That living for God, realizing that God will never leave you and that God will never forsake you. When He said to the disciples, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth. The last thing He wanted them to know was, when you go out to do this, when you go out to teach and baptize and teach, He knew what they were facing. They were facing the same thing He faced. And many of them had a similar end to what Jesus had. He said, don't forget, I'll always be there with you. When Daniel knew the decree had been signed, and he went home and he opened the window and he got down on his knees toward Jerusalem and he started praying, Daniel knew what was going to happen. And he didn't care, because he knew that God had this lesson. And when Daniel is in the lion's den, you know what Liam and I saw this morning was Daniel is pushed into the lion's den, and the lions begin to circle him. The look of fear, exhaustion, and worry as Daniel is backed up against the wall, and as the lions approach him, that he raised his eyes to heaven. He knew what God was going to do. Daniel knew that God's got this. And that God, we're told, is going to be with us in our trials. It doesn't mean there's not going to be any trials or any pain, that we won't have pain. But He's always going to be there, and it's always going to take care of it for us. And then we have to have confidence in both His presence and His grace all the time. And we have to anticipate that God knows what's best for us even when we don't know what's best for ourselves. And it is quite possible that He is allowing us to go through whatever we're going through because He's got something better in store for us than that. And it's important for us to remain faithful during those trials and let God handle everything that comes after that. The psalmist said, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them." He says that as a statement of fact. You remember what happened with Paul? "I've got this thorn in the flesh. I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. Take this away from me." He said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness." And therefore, you get to keep that affliction. And you remember how he summarized what that meant? "I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions in distress for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." When you read that passage where Paul just like a laundry list, it's like his persecution resume of all the things that had happened to him, shipwrecks and beatings and left for dead. That's what he's saying. I'm made strong in this weakness. And in Revelation 21, God's going to wipe away every tear. There's not going to be any more death or sorrow or crying. And when we study about heaven, and when we think about the life that is to come, everything that happens on this side will be made worth it. And in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul called it a light affliction, which is, by the way, for a moment, because it's working in us something that's much bigger than that, and so much more important, and so much greater, because it is the weight, catch the phrase, it is an eternal weight of glory. Do you look forward to that? How committed are you as we enter this new year to live for God? Do you need to think about what has to happen to get you in a right relationship with God? Those are what the Scriptures tell us to do. And for most of us, we've done many of those. But we have to constantly reassess. How did I do in 2024? And what am I going to do in 25 that's going to be different and more and better? We have an opportunity. The new year is a new beginning. It gives us a chance to think about, what do I want to do this year? What would you like to do for Beech Grove this year that you've not done in the past? I appreciate many of you. One of the reasons I appreciate Gretchen, she irritates me regularly and says, "Okay, so when are we going to have our next meal?" and she suggested, "Why don't we do something on Super Bowl Sunday?" And I said, let's do that. So she said, "We can have soup." I said, "Ooh, soup on Super Bowl Sunday. That makes sense to me." Do what you can do. She's good at that. That's one of her ministries. When I see these flowers change up here, I know who does the flowers. I know why they make a difference. And when I come in and I see Piggy trying to gather up the mouse droppings, and I know he's at he's doing what he can do. And when we come in and I see that the building has been warm, I know somebody got here in time to get it warm. What can you do in 25? It doesn't have to be world shattering. Do what Brother Pruitt, Terry bugged his friends until they showed up and visited. Do it. Keep inviting them. One of these days they'll show up. It's like the persistent widow. They give you what you want because they want you to just hush. Keep asking, keep begging, keep pleading, keep praying. But make 25 the best you've ever had in service to God. We're going to sing this song as a means of encouragement. If you have some need to respond to the invitation this morning, we want you to do that. If instead you just need to say a little prayer between you and God, and we're going to make things better, that's what you want to do. So when you face your lion's den, when you know what it is that you've got to go and be and to be strong and courageous about, go do it. Because God will make a difference in your life. Let's all stand as we sing.